Now looking at the First Civil War. So as said in the previous clip, there are some historians that argue that actually the Civil War originated from tension with Scotland and Ireland. Others argue that the Civil War does not start until Charles officially declares war on Parliament in 1642. But if you've got something on the Civil War itself, you can go right back to 1637. Anything before that is semi-irrelevant. So the Scottish Rebellion in 1637 was technically the start of the Civil Wars, even though it wasn't until 1642 that Charles declared war on Parliament. Charles had been defeated by the Scot Covenanters and was forced to sign the 1640 Truce of Ripon. But Parliament had created a secret deal with the Scots, which then formed something called the Solemn League and Covenant against the monarchy. So this is Scottish Presbyterians, Scottish Puritans joining forces with Pym and his followers against the monarchy. However, royalist moderates, e.g. the Earl of Montrose, which is a Scottish politician, supported the royalist cause with some initial success in 1644 to 45. However, the League and Covenant outnumbered Montrose's army, resulting in Charles losing support in Scotland overall. So we could say that Charles's downward slope to loss is triggered by Scotland. He did have some sympathy, but not an overall majority. Elsewhere in Ireland, Ulster Protestants were supported by Scottish troops, which resulted in their ownership of the most of the northern regions in Ireland by 1643, though the Catholic Confederation still had control over the rest of Ireland, but with the exception of Dublin. So Ireland could have swayed either way at this point. Yes, there's more Protestant presence coming within Ireland, but actually the vast majority of it is still controlled by the Catholic Confederation. Now, Charles made a one-year truce with the Catholic Confederation in order for them to support his royalist vassals in England. Whilst many Irish fought for Charles, they struggled to identify a common cause with the royalists, and this then limited his ability to recall further troops from Ireland. One of the issues with the royalist campaign is that Charles was neither a Catholic nor was he a Protestant, and any Catholic influences within his royal court was through his wife, who was seen as a foreigner. So yes, she's Catholic, but she's also a foreigner, and therefore Wentworth has been quite oppressive towards the Irish communities when he tried to maintain monarchy control over Ireland. And as a result of that, Charles isn't very frequent in paying his troops. He's not particularly forthcoming in giving them a common cause to fight for. So whilst, yes, Ireland did support Charles for a period of time, it's not a consistent feature of support throughout the entire war. And as a result of that, you could argue that the royalists were bound to be defeated because of the outnumbering of military troops. Likewise, Charles's forces were not well coordinated, and the parliamentarians hold on London by defeating the royalists at Turnham Green and at Marston Moor in 1644, which was the largest battle, essentially won them the First Civil War, combined with the support of Scottish Alliance, who were willing to travel south to defend the parliamentary cause. Don't forget, Charles has alienated the Scottish community. Yes, there are some moderates who feel that the radicals, so the Puritans and the Pym supporters, have gone too far. But at the same time, they weren't happy with Charles as their king. They saw him as an outsider who didn't have Scotland at the common heart of his intentions. Charles didn't visit Scotland until 8 years after he became King of England, and essentially he tried to overturn their whole religious belief through the Common Prayer Book. So Scotland became vital, I would say, towards the parliamentarians and gaining support. Scotland understood what Parliament were trying to stand for and what they were trying to fight for, unlike the Irish, who were asked to fight for Charles but failed to have a common cause and were not frequently paid. So the continued alliance with the Scottish Covenanters and a handful of losses meant further reforms were made, and as a result of that in 1644 the new model army was formed, which was commanded by Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. So Royalist commanders dismissed the power of the new model army initially and were defeated at Naseby in 1645. Simultaneously, so at the same time as Charles lost support in Ireland and Scotland. You need to remember that we don't have a sequence of events that are blocked at separate times in this period, that things do overlap. So Charles lost the support in Ireland and Scotland at the same time that they were defeated at the Battle of Naseby by the New Model Army, which they initially underestimated. And as a result of that, in May 1646, Charles surrendered to Scottish soldiers. Now, he surrenders to the Scots because he believes that the Scottish will be more sympathetic towards the peace treaty that would come about than the English would, because he's angered the English on a more lengthy basis than what he's angered the Scots. So it's a bit like Germany, where you're kind of more content with that topic, whereby the Kaiser is defeated, Germany is defeated in World War One. The Kaiser tries to share his powers with Prince Max of Baden, hoping that the Allies would take sympathy on him and be willing to negotiate. It's the same here. Charles thinks that Scotland would be more sympathetic towards him and that the peace treaty terms would be better for him than trying to negotiate with the English. However, the Scottish simply hand him over to the English, which he didn't expect, and he's placed under house arrest. So obviously Charles hasn't expected to be handed over to the English, and as said already, he goes under house arrest on the Isle of Wight whilst Parliament kind of decide what they're going to do with him. So what we need to kind of decipher is that, did Parliament win or did the Royalists just simply lose? And there's a slight difference between the two, that could Parliament have lost had the Royalists not been so weak? Likewise, could the Royalists have won had not Parliament had certain factors to support them? So we need to kind of decipher between the two. So we need to look at, why did the Royalists lose? One, there was a lack of central geographical control. Quite a lot of the areas that the Royalists took over were agricultural communities. The cities that they did acquire during the Civil War itself were not close as such to the political base of the country, and as a result of that they failed to kind of expand their control effectively. Likewise, the Royalist Council of War at Oxford was initially effective but lacked authority, as Royalist commanders elsewhere acted independently. So there was kind of no consistency across the commanders in the Royalist camp, who kind of decided to act sporadically without consulting one another, and therefore there was no unity within their forces. Charles also created a separate council in Bristol which encouraged confliction, because Oxford would be saying one thing, Bristol would be saying the other, bearing in mind there's obviously no Wi-Fi at this point in time. So it'd take quite a long time for messages to kind of get between Bristol and Oxford. That's if they weren't clashed up with any parliamentary presence en route to each other. And likewise, experienced commanders who were initially at Oxford were taken away to work in Bristol. Obviously, Oxford is geographically closer to London than Bristol is, and that was a tactical error on Charles's part. Likewise, Charles and his Royalists were very indecisive. It took them quite a long time to make decisions, fairly similar to Hitler with World War II, that he took quite a long time to make decisions, and this slowed up the military process. In addition, the lack of commitment and military experience of Charles's men undermined his campaign. Quite a lot of his initial commanders were, again, from agricultural communities. They had never really fought in a dramatic, escalated war before, only kind of in small campaigns. And he then kind of later realises this as he later appoints his nephews, Princess Rupert and Maurice. But that caused further division within the campaign. Rupert and Maurice were unpopular. And likewise, Henrietta Maria and Edward Hyde gave conflicting advice, combined with the fact that Charles had very poor leadership, all equated to the failure of the Royalist campaign. In contrast, we have, why did the parliamentarians win? Parliament were more flexible. Charles is very rigid in how he views the world from both a political and a military perspective. So Parliament were much more flexible in their response. If a particular campaign wasn't effective or didn't prove to be successful, they would adapt, and that enabled them to act effectively, as well as being more financially efficient. Likewise, they enforced a couple of taxes. Ironically, they also used the ship tax, like Charles did, to gain money. But unlike Charles, the Parliament could argue that they were raising this tax during wartime because they are at war. It's not quite the war that they would normally be gaining ship tax revenue from. They'd be using it for foreign wars. But this is still a war, it's just a civil war. So they ironically do use the ship tax. They also use something called the assessment tax, which is where you were taxing people's incomes. And that gave government a direct financial contribution towards the war effort. Vitally, though, Parliament had control of London, and London was vitally important for the campaign because obviously they were able to instill a series of propaganda, which was obviously anti-monarchist. They could also access parliamentary financial resources through the collection of taxation. London was also England's largest port, so they had the income and exports of products that would be needed to feed the population, but also to give military equipment to the New Model Army. In addition to that, you have kind of the administration of Parliament, the understanding of where battles have taken place and where we may have some battles coming up based on military strategies. So London became vitally important, and likewise Parliament controlled much of the south coast, which is where most of our navy is based as well, so that kind of undermined the royalist camp because they didn't really have a strong, stable army that all kind of had a common cause. They couldn't gain access to goods through trade because that was being blocked off by Parliament. And Pym was vital in persuading Parliament to form an alliance with the Scots. The Scots became very helpful to the parliamentarians because the parliamentarians had control of the south, the southern coast, London, but the Scots were also able to support from the north. So it is kind of an attack on two fronts against the royalist camp. Parliament spread the campaign to local government level as well, and this created jobs for men in these areas. And you kind of have more of a kind of a unity in the parliamentary camp that we are offering employment, we're offering a united front, we are offering a united cause, we are offering a united religious community that will not be undermined by Catholicism. So they had control of the navy, which permitted them to supply their troops whilst being able to hamper and prevent supply routes to the royalist forces. And the establishment of the New Model Army provided a wave of soldiers which were trained, they were professional, and they were regularly paid, whilst many of the soldiers also been dedicated to Puritan followers. So many of the soldiers were Protestant, they were Puritan, they were Calvinist, so they kind of had that religious link, but they were also regularly paid, which meant that they were devoted to the army because it was a way of life, it was a way of income. And they had a profession. They were trained in military combat, unlike Charles's troops, which are kind of gathered from scattered areas such as Ireland, such as moderate people from all over the country. That's not to say the parliamentarians gained support everywhere they went. There were communities that they came across whereby people just didn't want to choose. They didn't want to side with the parliamentarians in case the monarchy won and they were beheaded. Likewise, they didn't want to side with the royalists in case the parliamentaries won, in case they were punished by the parliament MPs. So there were many people who didn't want to become involved in the conflict, and some did deny being members of the New Model Army, but that was fine. I think one of the issues had they denied royalty or the royalist cause is that maybe they were fined by Charles, they were seen to be traitors to their country or to their king, and they were manipulated almost into joining the royalists, where the parliamentarians under Fairfax and Cromwell said if you don't want to join, that's absolutely fine. So the parliamentarians were much more liberal, and they had economic resources. They had a good, sound political base. They had military bases in the shape of Portsmouth with the Navy, with the Thames in accessing tradable products. The Royalists didn't really have any of that, and that's not to say that the Royalists couldn't have won, because had Charles been a more charismatic leader, had he effectively put together a good commander base, effectively he could have won. But his indecisiveness, his recruitment of inexperienced officers at the beginning of the Civil War, combined with his inability to gain control of cities, all undermined his campaign, because at the beginning of the Civil War, the Stuarts, the Royalist camp, were actually victorious in quite a few handful of battles, but that inability to create an alliance with Ireland his inability to negotiate, his inability to understand military strategy, or to at least get someone in that did understand it, all went against him, and enabled the parliamentarians to fix their bases, to create alliances with the Scots, to control the media, to control the economy, and to control the military bases, all meant that they were successful in the end.